When Trevor Sullivan received that phone call on March 15, 2015, telling him his wife Isabella was dead, he collapsed to his knees in their suburban Phoenix kitchen. But what the authorities didn't know, what Trevor couldn't have imagined, was that at that exact moment, Isabella Crawford Sullivan was very much alive, sitting in a coffee shop 400 miles away in Denver, carefully watching the news coverage of her own death on her laptop screen. This is the story of the most calculated disappearance in modern American history, and the truth behind it will leave you questioning everything you think you know about love, betrayal, and the lengths someone will go to escape their past. Most people believe that when you love someone, you do anything to protect them. Most people think that marriage means honesty, trust, and shared futures. Trevor Sullivan believed these things too, right up until the moment he discovered that the woman he'd been mourning for 4 years had been living a completely different life, with a completely different identity in a completely different state. But this story begins long before that devastating discovery, back when Trevor thought he was the luckiest man alive. Trevor Sullivan was 32 years old in 2015, a dedicated insurance adjuster living in Phoenix, Arizona. He had the kind of steady, dependable life that most people envied. Good job, nice house in a quiet neighborhood, and what he believed was a perfect marriage to Isabella Crawford, a 31-year-old Australian woman who had moved to the United States 5 years earlier on a work visa. Isabella was everything Trevor had ever wanted in a partner. She was beautiful, with striking blonde hair and green eyes that seemed to hold secrets. She spoke with that charming Australian accent that made even mundane conversations sound exotic. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, which gave her flexibility and independence that Trevor admired. They had met at a coffee shop in downtown Phoenix, a meeting that seemed like fate but would later prove to be anything but coincidental. What Trevor didn't know was that Isabella Crawford wasn't just keeping secrets. She was secret. Every single thing about her life, from her name to her past to her reasons for being in America, was a carefully constructed lie. And on that March afternoon when she supposedly died in a horrific car accident on Interstate 17, she was actually executing the final phase of a plan she had been working on for over 2 years. But the real shock wasn't just that she had faked her death. It was why she had done it, and what she had been hiding from Trevor all along. The phone call came while Trevor was reviewing insurance claims at his desk. The voice on the other end belonged to Officer Patricia Martinez from the Arizona Highway Patrol. Her tone was professional but gentle, the way law enforcement officers are trained to deliver life-changing news. She told Trevor that his wife's car, a silver Honda Civic, had been involved in a single-vehicle accident approximately 40 miles north of Phoenix. The vehicle had gone through the guardrail and plunged into a ravine. There had been an explosion. The car was completely destroyed, and the driver had been pronounced dead at the scene. Trevor's world stopped moving. The insurance files scattered across his desk suddenly seemed meaningless. The background noise of his office faded into silence. He asked Officer Martinez to repeat what she had said, hoping he had misunderstood, hoping this was some kind of administrative error. But the details were brutally clear. Isabella had been driving north on Interstate 17 at approximately 2:30 p.m. Weather conditions were clear. There were no other vehicles involved. The Honda Civic had somehow lost control, crashed through the barrier, and caught fire at the bottom of the ravine. By the time emergency responders reached the scene, there was nothing left to save. What made the tragedy even more devastating was that it seemed so senseless. Isabella had been driving to Flagstaff for what she told Trevor was a client meeting. She was supposed to return that evening. They had plans to go out for dinner at their favorite Italian restaurant. Trevor had even made reservations. Now, instead of planning their evening together, he was being asked to come to the morgue to identify whatever remains could be recovered from the wreckage. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. While Trevor was driving to the morgue with tears streaming down his face, while he was calling Isabella's sister in Sydney to deliver the devastating news, while he was trying to figure out how to plan a funeral for the woman he loved, Isabella was calmly checking into a hotel in Denver using a driver's license in the name of Sarah Mitchell. She had been Sarah Mitchell for over a year, carefully building this new identity while still living with Trevor as his devoted wife. She had a social security number for Sarah Mitchell. She had a credit history for Sarah Mitchell. She even had job references for Sarah Mitchell. Everything needed to start a new life had been meticulously prepared. The investigation into the accident was thorough but ultimately straightforward. The Honda Civic was registered to Isabella Crawford Sullivan. The license plate matched. The VIN number matched. Inside the burned wreckage, investigators found the charred remains of a single occupant along with personal items that belonged to Isabella. Her purse, containing her driver's license and credit cards. Her wedding ring, partially melted but still recognizable. Even her distinctive Australian passport, damaged by fire but with enough identifying information remaining to confirm her identity. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same tragic conclusion. Isabella Crawford Sullivan had died in a car accident on Interstate 17. What the investigators didn't know, what Trevor couldn't have suspected, was that the body in that car wasn't Isabella at all. The remains belonged to someone else entirely, someone whose disappearance would never be reported, someone whose absence would never be noticed. Isabella had found the perfect victim, someone living on the margins of society with no family, no close friends, no one who would come looking when she vanished. The planning had been meticulous, cold-blooded, and absolutely brilliant in its execution. But this calculated deception wasn't just about escaping her marriage to Trevor. Isabella wasn't just a woman looking for a fresh start or trying to get out of a bad relationship. She was running from something much more serious, something that would have destroyed not just her future, but Trevor's as well if the truth had ever come to light. Because Isabella Crawford wasn't actually from Australia at all. Her accent was fake, learned from movies and perfected through years of practice. Her Australian passport was a forgery, expertly crafted but completely fraudulent. Even her name was stolen from a real person, a woman who had died in a car accident in Melbourne 3 years before Isabella adopted her identity. The real Isabella Crawford had been a graphic designer living in Melbourne who died tragically young, with no close family and few friends. The woman Trevor married had somehow obtained her personal information and assumed her identity completely. She had used the real Isabella's credentials to obtain a work visa to the United States. She had built an entire fictional backstory around the real Isabella's life, creating memories and experiences that had never actually happened. For 5 years she had lived as a ghost, using a dead woman's identity to create a new life in America. As Trevor sat in the funeral home making arrangements for his wife's memorial service, choosing flowers and writing obituaries, the woman he thought was dead was already settling into her new life as Sarah Mitchell in Denver. She had rented a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. She had opened a bank account. She had even started looking for work as a graphic designer, using skills that were actually her own, perhaps the only genuine thing about her entire existence. The funeral was held on a rainy Thursday morning at Desert View Memorial Gardens in Phoenix. About 50 people attended, mostly Trevor's family and friends, along with a few co-workers from Isabella's freelance design business. Trevor stood at the graveside, staring at a casket that contained the remains of a complete stranger, mourning a woman who was at that very moment unpacking boxes in her new Denver apartment. His grief was real and devastating, made worse by the fact that he was completely alone in it. Isabella had always claimed her family in Australia was distant and wouldn't be able to attend. Even in death, she had ensured that no one would come looking for her. But the most heartbreaking part of Trevor's grief was the way it consumed his entire life. He took extended leave from work, unable to concentrate on insurance claims when his own life felt like a disaster that could never be adjusted or repaired. He stopped eating regularly, lost weight, and barely slept. Friends and family tried to support him, but Trevor's pain was so profound that it created a barrier between him and everyone else. He felt like he was drowning in a world that had suddenly become foreign and hostile. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell was thriving in Denver. She had found work with a small advertising agency, impressing her new employers with her design skills and professional demeanor. She rented a modern apartment in the Lodo district, bought new furniture, and even adopted a cat from the local animal shelter. To her new colleagues and neighbors, she was simply a talented designer who had relocated from Phoenix for a fresh start. No one questioned her story because there was no reason to doubt it. What Trevor couldn't understand in those first months after Isabella's death was why he felt so empty, so fundamentally disconnected from everything around him. Grief counselors told him this was normal, that losing a spouse suddenly and tragically would naturally leave him feeling lost and confused. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite articulate even to himself. It was as if the woman he had mourned wasn't quite the woman he had lived with, as if there had always been pieces of Isabella that didn't quite fit together, inconsistencies he had ignored because he loved her so completely. During those long, sleepless nights in their Phoenix home, Trevor found himself going through Isabella's belongings with the desperate hope of feeling closer to her memory. But instead of comfort, he found more questions. Her laptop was password protected with a code he didn't know, despite the fact that they had always shared everything. Her phone had been destroyed in the accident, but when he tried to access her cloud storage accounts, he discovered she had changed all the passwords just weeks before her death. Even her design portfolio, which she had always been eager to show him, seemed to have vanished completely from their shared computer. The financial aftermath of Isabella's death created additional stress that Trevor hadn't anticipated. Despite being married for 3 years, Isabella had insisted on keeping their finances largely separate. She paid her share of household expenses from her freelance income, but Trevor realized he had no access to her business accounts or client information. When he tried to contact her clients to inform them of her death, he discovered that many of the companies she claimed to work for had never heard of Isabella Crawford. The few legitimate clients he could locate said they had only worked with her briefly and had no ongoing projects. But the most disturbing discovery came when Trevor tried to settle Isabella's affairs with immigration services. As an Australian citizen on a work visa, her death should have triggered certain administrative procedures. However, when Trevor contacted the immigration office, he was told that there was no record of Isabella Crawford entering the United States on a work visa. The officer he spoke with was confused and suggested there might be some administrative error, but after multiple calls and inquiries, the message remained the same. According to official records, Isabella Crawford had never legally entered the United States. This revelation sent Trevor into a spiral of confusion and desperate investigation. He contacted the Australian consulate, hoping they could help clarify the situation. The consular officer was sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful. They had no record of Isabella Crawford as an Australian citizen. When Trevor provided her passport number, they confirmed that the document appeared to be fraudulent. The passport number belonged to a different person entirely, someone who had died in Melbourne several years earlier. Trevor's world, already shattered by grief, began to crumble in entirely new ways. The woman he had loved, the woman he had married, the woman he had mourned apparently didn't exist. At least not in any official capacity. He began to wonder if he was losing his mind, if grief had somehow distorted his memories or his understanding of reality. He made appointments with doctors, convinced that stress had caused some kind of psychological break that was making him imagine impossible things. Meanwhile, in Denver, Sarah Mitchell was building relationships with her new co-workers and establishing herself as a reliable, talented member of the advertising agency's creative team. She had a particular talent for understanding client needs and translating them into compelling visual designs. Her supervisor, Janet Holloway, was impressed by Sarah's professionalism and her ability to work independently. Sarah never mentioned having been married, never spoke about any family, and seemed to have no interest in discussing her past beyond the basic professional information required for employment. What made Sarah's transition so seamless was her genuine skill as a graphic designer. Unlike her stolen identity and fabricated personal history, her professional abilities were entirely authentic. She had spent years developing her craft, and her portfolio of work was legitimately impressive. This gave her confidence in her new role and helped her build credibility with clients and colleagues who had no reason to suspect that Sarah Mitchell was anything other than what she appeared to be. But Sarah's success in Denver wasn't just about professional competence. She had also become extraordinarily skilled at reading people, at understanding what they wanted to hear and how to present herself in ways that would gain their trust and acceptance. With her coworkers, she was friendly but not overly personal, professional but approachable. She attended office social events but never stayed too late or revealed too much about herself. She was the perfect colleague, memorable enough to be liked but not so distinctive that people would remember specific details about her if questioned later. Back in Phoenix, Trevor's investigation into Isabella's true identity had reached a dead end, but his obsession with understanding what had happened was growing stronger. He hired a private investigator, Marcus Chin, a former police detective who specialized in missing persons and identity fraud cases. Chin was initially skeptical of Trevor's story, suggesting that grief might be causing him to misinterpret bureaucratic confusion for something more sinister. But as Chin began his own investigation, he quickly realized that Trevor's concerns were not only valid but potentially much more serious than either of them had initially understood. Chen's first breakthrough came when he obtained copies of the accident report and began examining the physical evidence more carefully. The car that had crashed and burned was definitely Isabella's Honda Civic, registered in her name and matching all the vehicle identification numbers. But when Chen looked more closely at the timeline of events, he found several inconsistencies that the original investigators had overlooked. Security camera footage from a gas station 20 miles south of the accident site showed Isabella's car passing by at 1:45 p.m., which would have put her at the crash location around 2:15 p.m. But the accident wasn't reported until 2:30 p.m., and the first emergency responders didn't arrive until 2:45 p.m. This 15-minute gap might have seemed insignificant, but Chen knew that in cases involving staged accidents, timing was often the key to understanding what had really happened. He also noticed that the accident had occurred in a particularly remote section of Interstate 17, an area with no security cameras and minimal traffic during weekday afternoons. If someone wanted to stage a car accident without witnesses, this would have been an ideal location. Chen's investigation took another significant turn when he began looking into the dental records that had been used to identify the body found in the wreckage. The remains were so badly burned that visual identification had been impossible, so the medical examiner had relied on dental records provided by Isabella's dentist in Phoenix. But when Chen contacted the dental office, he discovered that Isabella had only been a patient there for 6 months before her death, and her dental records were surprisingly sparse. She had come in for routine cleanings and had claimed that her previous dental records had been lost when she moved from Australia. The dentist, Dr. Patricia Reeves, remembered Isabella as a pleasant but somewhat nervous patient who always paid in cash and seemed reluctant to provide detailed medical history. Dr. Reeves had found this unusual but not necessarily suspicious, as some international patients had difficulty obtaining their previous medical records. However, when Chen asked to review the records that had been used for identification, Dr. Reeves made a disturbing discovery. The dental x-rays in Isabella's file didn't match the x-rays that had been sent to the medical examiner's office for comparison. This revelation suggested that someone had deliberately provided false dental records to ensure that the body in the car would be identified as Isabella Crawford. But who had access to Isabella's dental file, and how had they managed to substitute different x-rays without Dr. Reeves noticing? The answer pointed to a level of premeditation and planning that made Chen realize this wasn't just a case of insurance fraud or a woman trying to escape a bad marriage. This was something much more sophisticated and potentially much more dangerous. As Chen dug deeper into Isabella's background, he began to uncover a pattern of identity theft and document fraud that stretched back years before she had ever met Trevor. The real Isabella Crawford, the Australian woman whose identity had been stolen, had died in a car accident in Melbourne in 2010. But the woman who had married Trevor hadn't assumed this identity until 2012, which meant she had been living under a different name for at least 2 years after the real Isabella's death. Chen's investigation revealed that the woman Trevor knew as Isabella had previously lived in Los Angeles under the name Rebecca Martinez, working as a freelance graphic designer and living in a small apartment in Silver Lake. Before that, she had been in Seattle using the name Jennifer Walsh and working for a small marketing firm. Each identity had been carefully constructed and maintained for approximately 2 years before being abandoned for a new one. The pattern suggested someone who was either running from law enforcement or involved in some kind of long-term criminal enterprise that required frequent identity changes. But the most chilling discovery came when Chen found evidence that Isabella had been planning her disappearance for over a year before the staged accident. Bank records showed that she had been slowly transferring small amounts of money to accounts in different states, building up financial resources for her new life. She had also been researching remote areas along Interstate 17, using her laptop to view satellite images and traffic patterns for various locations. The accident site hadn't been chosen randomly. It had been selected specifically because it offered the best opportunity to stage a convincing death without witnesses. Trevor's reaction to Chen's findings was a mixture of devastation and rage. The woman he had loved and mourned hadn't just left him. She had used him as part of an elaborate criminal scheme. She had stolen the identity of a dead woman, married him under false pretenses, and then faked her own death, leaving him to grieve for someone who had never really existed. But even more disturbing was the realization that Isabella's crimes hadn't ended with her disappearance. Somewhere out there, she was living a new life under another stolen identity, potentially targeting another innocent victim the way she had targeted him. The question that haunted Trevor was why Isabella had chosen him specifically. Had their meeting at the coffee shop really been coincidental, or had she selected him as a target for reasons he still didn't understand? Chen's investigation suggested that Isabella's choice of victims wasn't random. Each of her previous identities had involved relationships with men who worked in positions that could provide useful information or resources. Her relationship with Trevor, an insurance adjuster with access to accident reports and claim information, would have been particularly valuable for someone planning to stage their own death. As Chen's investigation deepened, he uncovered something that made Trevor's blood run cold. The woman he had known as Isabella hadn't just been planning her own disappearance. She had been studying Trevor's work, learning about insurance fraud investigation techniques, and using his own expertise against him. During their marriage, she had often asked him about his cases, showing what seemed like genuine interest in his work. She would ask detailed questions about how accident scenes were investigated, what evidence investigators looked for, and how insurance companies determined whether claims were legitimate or fraudulent. Trevor had been flattered by her interest, never suspecting that she was gathering intelligence for her own criminal purposes. But that's just the beginning, because what Chen discovered next would reveal the true scope of Isabella's deception and the real reason she had targeted Trevor specifically. Hidden in the financial records Chen had obtained through his investigation was evidence of a much larger criminal operation. Isabella hadn't been working alone. She was part of a sophisticated identity theft ring that specialized in assuming the identities of deceased individuals and using those identities to commit various forms of fraud. Trevor's expertise in insurance investigation had made him an invaluable unwitting asset to this criminal enterprise. The revelation that Isabella was part of a larger criminal organization explained many of the inconsistencies that had puzzled Trevor during their marriage. Her frequent business trips, which she claimed were client meetings, had actually been coordination meetings with other members of the identity theft ring. Her reluctance to discuss her family or past wasn't just about maintaining her false identity, it was about protecting the other criminals she worked with. Even her insistence on keeping their finances separate wasn't about independence. It was about preventing Trevor from discovering the true source of her income. Chen's investigation revealed that the identity theft ring operated across multiple states, with members assuming new identities every few years and moving to different locations to avoid detection. They specialized in targeting recently deceased individuals whose deaths hadn't been widely reported, particularly people who had died in accidents or had limited family connections. They would obtain death certificates, social security numbers, and other identifying information, then use sophisticated document forgery techniques to create complete new identities. What made this criminal organization particularly dangerous was their patience and attention to detail. Unlike typical identity thieves who use stolen information for quick financial gain, these criminals built long-term lives around their assumed identities. They established credit histories, employment records, and social connections that made their false identities virtually undetectable. Isabella's 3-year marriage to Trevor was just one example of how thoroughly they integrated themselves into their assumed lives. The financial scope of the operation was staggering. Chen estimated that the ring had stolen millions of dollars through various fraud schemes, including insurance fraud, credit card fraud, and mortgage fraud. Isabella's role in the organization appeared to be particularly important, as her graphic design skills allowed her to create convincing forged documents that other members of the ring used to establish their false identities. She wasn't just a participant in the criminal enterprise, she was one of its key operational assets. But here's where it gets really interesting, because Chen's investigation also revealed that Isabella's staged death wasn't just about escaping her life with Trevor. It was about escaping law enforcement. Federal investigators had been closing in on the identity theft ring, and several members had already been arrested in other states. Isabella's disappearance had been timed to coincide with a major FBI operation that was targeting the organization's leadership. By faking her death, she had not only escaped prosecution but had also eliminated any evidence that could have led investigators to other members of the ring. The body that had been found in Isabella's car belonged to Maria Santos, a homeless woman who had been living in Phoenix with no family or close friends. Maria had struggled with addiction and mental health issues, making her an ideal victim for Isabella's purposes because her disappearance wouldn't be immediately noticed or investigated. Chen's investigation revealed that Isabella had been monitoring Maria for several weeks before the staged accident, learning her routines and waiting for the right opportunity to abduct her. The method Isabella had used to kill Maria was particularly cold-blooded. Toxicology reports from the medical examiner's office showed that Maria had been drugged with a powerful sedative before the car was set on fire. This meant that Maria had been unconscious but still alive when the car went over the guardrail and exploded. Isabella had essentially murdered an innocent woman to fake her own death, showing a level of callousness that shocked even experienced investigators like Chen. Trevor's reaction to learning about Maria Santos was devastating. Not only had he been deceived and used by Isabella, but an innocent woman had died because of the criminal scheme he had unknowingly been part of. The guilt and horror of this realization sent Trevor into a deep depression that required professional counseling and medication. He felt responsible for Maria's death, even though he had no knowledge of Isabella's true nature or criminal activities. Meanwhile, in Denver, Sarah Mitchell was continuing to build her new life with the same methodical precision she had used in all her previous identities. She had established herself as a valued employee at the advertising agency and had even begun dating a coworker named David Park, a junior account executive who was impressed by her intelligence and sophistication. David had no idea that the woman he was falling in love with was a wanted criminal who had murdered an innocent person to assume her current identity. Sarah's relationship with David followed the same pattern she had used with Trevor and her previous victims. She was charming and attentive, but always maintained a certain emotional distance that made her seem mysterious and intriguing. She shared just enough personal information to seem open and honest, but never enough to allow anyone to verify her background or discover inconsistencies in her story. She was a master manipulator who understood exactly how to make people trust her while keeping them from getting too close to the truth. But Sarah's success in Denver was about to be threatened by an unexpected development. Chen's investigation had attracted the attention of federal law enforcement agencies who were already investigating the identity theft ring. FBI agent Rebecca Torres had been tracking the organization for over 2 years, and Chen's findings provided crucial new evidence about how the ring operated and who its key members were. Agent Torres realized that if Isabella was still alive, as Chen's investigation suggested, she could be the key to dismantling the entire criminal organization. The FBI's investigation into the identity theft ring had been hampered by the sophisticated methods the criminals used to cover their tracks. Traditional investigative techniques had been largely ineffective because the ring members were so skilled at assuming new identities and disappearing when law enforcement got too close. But Isabella's staged death had left behind more evidence than she had realized, and Chen's thorough investigation had uncovered patterns and connections that federal investigators could use to track down other members of the organization. Agent Torres decided to work with Chen and Trevor to set up a trap for Isabella. The plan was to use Trevor as bait, making it appear that he had discovered evidence of Isabella's survival and was trying to track her down. The FBI would monitor Trevor's activities and communications, hoping that Isabella would make contact with him or take some action that would reveal her current location and identity. It was a dangerous plan that required Trevor to essentially become an undercover operative in the investigation of his own wife's crimes. Trevor's participation in the FBI operation was motivated by a combination of anger, guilt, and a desperate need for justice. He wanted to see Isabella brought to justice for her crimes, particularly for the murder of Maria Santos. But he also wanted answers about why she had chosen him and whether their entire relationship had been nothing more than a criminal scheme. The emotional toll of participating in the investigation was enormous, but Trevor felt he owed it to Maria Santos and to himself to see it through to the end. The FBI's plan required Trevor to begin making public statements about his belief that Isabella was still alive. He gave interviews to local news stations, posted on social media, and even hired a billboard company to display messages asking for information about Isabella's whereabouts. The goal was to create enough public attention that Isabella would feel compelled to respond, either by contacting Trevor directly or by taking action to protect her new identity. But what neither the FBI nor Trevor anticipated was how Isabella would react to learning that her carefully planned disappearance was being investigated. Sarah Mitchell had been monitoring news coverage from Phoenix as part of her routine security precautions, and she was alarmed to discover that Trevor was publicly questioning her death. Even more concerning was the fact that he seemed to have evidence suggesting she was still alive. This development threatened not just her current identity but the safety of the entire criminal organization she was part of. Sarah's response to this threat would prove that she was even more dangerous than anyone had realized. Rather than simply disappearing again and assuming a new identity, she decided to take direct action to eliminate the threat that Trevor and the investigation posed to her freedom. She began planning a return to Phoenix, not to reunite with her former husband, but to silence him permanently. The woman who had already committed murder to fake her own death was prepared to kill again to protect her new life. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the full extent of Isabella's crimes and put Trevor's life in immediate danger. But neither Trevor nor the FBI investigators realized how close they were to uncovering not just Isabella's current location, but the entire criminal network she was part of. The investigation that had begun as a search for answers about a suspicious death was about to become a race against time to prevent multiple murders and dismantle one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in the country. Sarah Mitchell's decision to return to Phoenix wasn't made impulsively. For 3 days she sat in her Denver apartment, methodically planning her response to what she saw as an existential threat to her freedom and safety. She had survived this long by being smarter and more ruthless than anyone who might pursue her, and she wasn't about to let Trevor's investigation destroy everything she had built. But what made Sarah's planning so terrifying was that she didn't just want to silence Trevor. She wanted to send a message to law enforcement that pursuing her would come at a deadly cost. The first step in Sarah's plan was to gather intelligence about Trevor's current situation and the scope of the investigation into her disappearance. Using sophisticated hacking techniques she had learned during her years in the identity theft ring, she accessed Trevor's email accounts, social media profiles, and even his work computer at the insurance company. What she discovered made her realize that the threat was even more serious than she had initially understood. Trevor wasn't just asking questions about her death. He was working with a private investigator and federal law enforcement to actively hunt her down. Sarah's review of Trevor's communications revealed the full extent of what Chin and the FBI had discovered about her past identities and criminal activities. They knew about Rebecca Martinez in Los Angeles and Jennifer Walsh in Seattle. They had connected her to the identity theft ring and understood the sophisticated methods she used to assume new identities. Most dangerously, they had identified Maria Santos as the real victim of the car accident and were treating Isabella's disappearance as a murder case rather than just insurance fraud. But here's what made Sarah's situation truly desperate. The FBI investigation had progressed far enough that they were close to identifying other members of the identity theft ring. Sarah's criminal associates were depending on her to maintain her cover and protect the organization's secrets. If she was captured and decided to cooperate with law enforcement, she could bring down the entire network and send dozens of criminals to prison for decades. The pressure from her criminal partners was intense, and they had made it clear that failure to contain the investigation would have deadly consequences for Sarah herself. Sarah's plan for dealing with Trevor was characteristically methodical and brutal. She would return to Phoenix under a new temporary identity, eliminate Trevor and anyone else who posed a threat to her safety, and then disappear permanently to a location where even her criminal associates couldn't find her. She had been preparing for this possibility for years, maintaining emergency funds and backup identities that she could use if her current life was compromised. But first, she needed to send a clear message that pursuing her was a fatal mistake. The identity Sarah chose for her return to Phoenix belonged to Amanda Foster, a real estate agent from Tucson who had died in a hiking accident 6 months earlier. Sarah had been monitoring obituaries and death records as part of her routine security precautions, and Amanda's death had occurred in circumstances that made her identity particularly useful. Amanda had been single, had recently moved to Arizona from another state, and had limited local connections that might notice inconsistencies in someone assuming her identity. Sarah's transformation into Amanda Foster was flawless. She altered her appearance with hair dye and colored contact lenses, changed her style of dress to match Amanda's professional image, and even practiced mimicking Amanda's speech patterns based on videos she found online. Within 48 hours, Sarah Mitchell had effectively ceased to exist, replaced by a woman who could move freely in Arizona without triggering any recognition from people who might be looking for Isabella Crawford. But what Trevor and the FBI didn't realize was that Sarah had been monitoring their investigation so closely that she knew about their plan to use Trevor as bait. She understood that his public statements about her survival were designed to draw her out, and she was prepared to turn their trap against them. Instead of responding predictably to Trevor's provocations, she would use his own investigation to identify and eliminate everyone who posed a threat to her freedom. Sarah's first target wasn't Trevor himself, but Marcus Chin, the private investigator whose thorough work had uncovered so much evidence about her criminal activities. Chen had become the primary threat to her safety, and eliminating him would also send a clear message to law enforcement about the consequences of pursuing her. Sarah spent 2 days surveilling Chen's office and home, learning his routines and identifying opportunities to strike without being detected. Chen's murder was planned with the same cold precision that Sarah had used to kill Maria Santos. She waited until Chen was working late in his office, a converted warehouse in an industrial area of Phoenix with minimal security and few witnesses. Using lock-picking skills she had developed during her criminal career, Sarah gained entry to the building and confronted Chen while he was reviewing files related to her case. The confrontation was brief and brutal, ending with Chen's death from what would appear to be a robbery gone wrong. But Sarah's killing of Chen wasn't just about eliminating a threat. It was about psychological warfare against Trevor and the FBI. She left Chen's body arranged in a way that would send a clear message to anyone investigating her case. The files related to Isabella Crawford's disappearance were scattered around the office, some of them burned, others torn apart. On Chen's desk, Sarah left a single photograph of Trevor taken recently outside his Phoenix home, with a message written on the back, "Stop looking or you're next." Trevor's reaction to Chen's murder was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. The discovery of his investigator's body, along with a threatening message, sent Trevor into a panic that made him question whether continuing the investigation was worth the risk to his own life. The FBI agents working the case were also shaken by the brutal killing, realizing that they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than they had initially understood. Sarah had successfully escalated the stakes of the investigation to a level that made everyone involved reconsider their commitment to bringing her to justice. But Agent Torres wasn't intimidated by Sarah's violent message. If anything, Chen's murder convinced her that Isabella Crawford was too dangerous to remain free and that the investigation needed to be intensified rather than abandoned. Torres increased the federal resources dedicated to the case and brought in additional agents with experience in tracking violent fugitives. She also implemented enhanced security measures for Trevor, recognizing that he was likely Sarah's next target. The FBI's response to Chen's murder included a comprehensive review of all evidence related to the identity theft ring and Isabella's criminal activities. This review revealed connections and patterns that had been missed in the initial investigation, including evidence that the ring had been responsible for multiple murders over the years. Isabella wasn't just a document forger and identity thief. She was a serial killer who had been eliminating witnesses and rivals for years without being detected. Sarah's escalation of violence had an unintended consequence that would ultimately lead to her downfall. The brutal murder of Chen attracted media attention that brought the case to national prominence, making it much more difficult for Sarah to operate without being recognized. News outlets across the country picked up the story of the woman who had faked her death and was now killing people to protect her secret. Sarah's photograph, both as Isabella Crawford and in computer-generated images showing how she might look with altered appearance, was broadcast on television and published in newspapers nationwide. The media coverage also brought forward witnesses who had encountered Sarah during her various identity changes over the years. Former co-workers, neighbors, and acquaintances began contacting law enforcement with information about suspicious behavior they had observed but hadn't reported at the time. This flood of new information allowed the FBI to piece together a much more complete picture of Sarah's criminal activities and movement patterns. But the most significant development came when David Park, Sarah's boyfriend in Denver, recognized her photograph on the news and realized that the woman he had been dating was a wanted murderer. David's call to the FBI provided them with Sarah's current identity as Sarah Mitchell and her last known address in Denver. For the first time since her disappearance, law enforcement had a concrete lead on Sarah's location and current identity. The FBI's response to this breakthrough was swift and overwhelming. Within hours of receiving David's call, federal agents had surrounded Sarah's Denver apartment and were preparing to arrest her. But when they breached the door, they found the apartment empty except for a note addressed to Trevor Sullivan. The message was brief but chilling: "You should have left me dead. Now everyone you care about will join me in the grave." Sarah had once again anticipated law enforcement's moves and escaped before they could capture her. But this time, her escape came at a significant cost. She had been forced to abandon the carefully constructed life she had built as Sarah Mitchell, leaving behind financial resources and support networks that would be difficult to replace. More importantly, she was now a nationally recognized fugitive with limited options for assuming a new identity. The discovery that Sarah had escaped from Denver sent shockwaves through the FBI investigation team. They realized that she had been monitoring their activities so closely that she knew about their plans almost as quickly as they made them. This suggested that Sarah had access to law enforcement communications or had infiltrated their investigation in some way that they hadn't detected. The possibility that she had accomplices within law enforcement agencies added a new level of complexity and danger to the case. Trevor's reaction to learning that Sarah had escaped and was threatening everyone he cared about was a mixture of terror and determination. He realized that his decision to pursue the investigation had put not just himself but his family and friends in mortal danger. But he also understood that backing down now wouldn't guarantee their safety, since Sarah had already demonstrated her willingness to kill anyone who posed a threat to her freedom. The FBI's manhunt for Sarah intensified dramatically after her escape from Denver. Agent Torres coordinated with law enforcement agencies across the country to monitor airports, bus stations, and border crossings. They also increased surveillance of Trevor and his family, knowing that Sarah's threats against them were likely to be carried out. But despite these extensive efforts, Sarah seemed to have vanished completely, leaving no trace of her current location or identity. What law enforcement didn't realize was that Sarah's escape from Denver had been planned months in advance as part of her standard security protocols. She had maintained multiple backup identities in safe houses across the country, allowing her to disappear quickly if her current identity was compromised. Her next identity was already prepared and waiting, complete with financial resources and documentation that would allow her to start over once again. Sarah's new identity as Catherine Wells had been in preparation for over a year, carefully constructed with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made her previous disappearances so successful. Catherine Wells was supposedly a widow from Portland who had recently inherited money from her deceased husband's life insurance policy and was looking to relocate somewhere warm and quiet to start over. The identity was perfect for Sarah's purposes because it explained her lack of local connections and provided a plausible reason for having significant financial resources without a traditional employment history. But what made Sarah's transformation into Catherine Wells particularly dangerous was that she had learned from the mistakes that led to her exposure in Denver. This time, she wasn't planning to build a long-term life under her new identity. Instead, she was using Catherine Wells as a temporary cover while she planned her final revenge against Trevor and everyone who had participated in hunting her down. Sarah had decided that if she couldn't live peacefully under an assumed identity, she would eliminate everyone who threatened her freedom and then disappear permanently to a country without extradition treaties with the United States. Sarah's plan for revenge was as methodical as everything else she had done throughout her criminal career. She had compiled a list of targets that included not just Trevor, but also Agent Torres, the FBI agents working the case, and even Trevor's family members who might provide law enforcement with information about his whereabouts. She planned to work through the list systematically, making each death appear accidental or unrelated to the others, until everyone who posed a threat to her had been eliminated. The first phase of Sarah's revenge plan involved gathering detailed intelligence about each of her targets. Using her skills in computer hacking and surveillance, she accessed personal information about Trevor's daily routines, his family schedules, and the security measures the FBI had implemented to protect them. She discovered that Trevor was living in a safe house under federal protection, but that his elderly parents were still in their Phoenix home with only minimal security coverage. Sarah's decision to target Trevor's parents first was calculated to cause him maximum psychological damage while also demonstrating her ability to strike at anyone connected to him. Harold and Margaret Sullivan were both in their 70s and had no idea that their son's investigation into his wife's death had put them in mortal danger. They continued to live their normal lives, going to church, visiting friends, and maintaining the routines they had followed for decades, completely unaware that a killer was watching their every move. But here's where Sarah's plan encountered an unexpected obstacle that would ultimately lead to her downfall. Agent Torres had anticipated that Sarah might target Trevor's family and had implemented covert surveillance of his parents' home without telling them about the threat. When Sarah began conducting reconnaissance of the Sullivan house, she was unknowingly being watched by federal agents who were waiting for exactly this kind of activity. The FBI's surveillance of the Sullivan home was part of a larger strategy to capture Sarah by allowing her to believe she had the advantage while actually controlling the situation. Agent Torres had realized that Sarah's psychological profile suggested she would be unable to resist the opportunity for revenge, even if it meant taking significant risks. By making Trevor's parents appear vulnerable while actually protecting them with hidden security, the FBI was setting a trap that would be difficult for Sarah to detect or avoid. Sarah's first attempt to approach the Sullivan house came on a quiet Tuesday morning when Harold Sullivan was working in his garden and Margaret was inside preparing lunch. Sarah, disguised as Catherine Wells and dressed as a door-to-door saleswoman, walked up to the front door with a clipboard and a friendly smile. She had planned to gain entry to the house by posing as someone conducting a survey, then kill both of Trevor's parents in a way that would appear to be a home invasion robbery. But as Sarah approached the front door, she was immediately surrounded by FBI agents who had been waiting in concealment around the property. The arrest was swift and overwhelming, with agents emerging from hidden positions in the garden, the garage, and neighboring houses. Sarah found herself face down on the Sullivans' front porch with multiple weapons pointed at her before she could even reach for the gun she had concealed in her purse. The capture of Sarah Crawford, after 4 years of living under assumed identities and committing multiple murders, was a moment of triumph for law enforcement and devastating relief for Trevor Sullivan. But even in custody, Sarah remained defiant and dangerous, refusing to cooperate with investigators and making threats against everyone who had participated in her capture. She showed no remorse for her crimes and seemed to view her arrest as a temporary setback rather than the end of her criminal career. Trevor's first sight of Sarah in custody was emotionally overwhelming in ways he hadn't anticipated. The woman he had loved and mourned looked older and harder than he remembered, with cold eyes that showed no recognition of their shared history or acknowledgement of the pain she had caused him. When their eyes met across the courtroom during her arraignment, Sarah smiled at him with the same charming expression she had used during their marriage, but now it seemed predatory and terrifying rather than loving. The trial of Sarah Crawford became a media sensation that exposed the full scope of her criminal activities and the sophisticated identity theft ring she had been part of. Prosecutors presented evidence of at least 7 murders committed by Sarah over a span of 10 years, including the killing of Maria Santos to fake her own death and the murder of Marcus Chen to intimidate investigators. The trial revealed that Sarah had been born Jennifer Walsh in Detroit and had begun her criminal career as a teenager, gradually developing the skills and connections that allowed her to become one of the most successful identity thieves in the country. But the most shocking revelation of the trial came when prosecutors presented evidence that Sarah had been planning to kill Trevor from almost the beginning of their relationship. Computer files recovered from her various hideouts showed that she had researched methods for murdering spouses and making their deaths appear accidental. Trevor's value to her hadn't been as a husband or partner, but as a source of information about insurance investigation techniques and as a potential victim whose death could provide her with life insurance money and sympathy that would help her assume her next identity. The psychological evaluation of Sarah conducted for the trial revealed a complete lack of empathy or remorse that shocked even experienced forensic psychiatrists. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who spent dozens of hours interviewing Sarah, described her as one of the most manipulative and dangerous individuals she had ever encountered. Sarah viewed other people not as human beings with their own rights and feelings, but as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be eliminated depending on their usefulness to her goals. During the trial, Sarah attempted to manipulate the proceedings by claiming that she had been the victim of domestic abuse and had faked her death to escape Trevor's violence. She presented herself as a frightened woman who had been forced into criminal activity by circumstances beyond her control. But the evidence against her was overwhelming, and her attempts at manipulation only served to demonstrate the calculating nature of her personality and her complete lack of genuine emotion or remorse. The jury's verdict was unanimous on all counts, finding Sarah guilty of multiple murders, identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that she would never again have the opportunity to assume a false identity or harm innocent people. As the sentence was read, Sarah showed no emotion except for a brief moment when she looked directly at Trevor and mouthed the words, "This isn't over," a final threat that sent chills through everyone in the courtroom. Trevor's journey from grieving widower to survivor of an elaborate criminal scheme had taken 4 years and had cost him his peace of mind, his trust in other people, and his faith in his own judgment. But it had also given him something unexpected: a sense of purpose in helping other victims of identity theft and fraud. Trevor began working with law enforcement agencies to develop better methods for detecting and preventing the kind of sophisticated identity theft that Sarah had specialized in. The dismantling of the identity theft ring that Sarah had been part of led to dozens of additional arrests and convictions across multiple states. Federal investigators discovered that the organization had been responsible for hundreds of millions of dollars in fraud and had ruined the lives of countless innocent victims whose identities had been stolen. Sarah's capture and conviction became a turning point in the fight against organized identity theft, leading to new laws and investigative techniques that made it much more difficult for criminals to assume false identities. But perhaps the most important outcome of Trevor's ordeal was the closure it provided for the family of Maria Santos, the homeless woman who had been murdered so that Sarah could fake her death. Maria's sister, who had been searching for her for years, finally learned what had happened and was able to give Maria a proper burial with the dignity she deserved. Trevor attended the funeral and spoke about Maria's innocence and the injustice of her death, helping to ensure that she would be remembered as more than just a victim of someone else's crime. The story of Sarah Crawford's elaborate deception and eventual capture became a cautionary tale about the dangers of identity theft and the importance of thorough background checks in personal relationships. But for Trevor, it was also a story of survival and the power of persistence in seeking justice. He had lost 4 years of his life to grief and deception, but he had ultimately helped bring a dangerous criminal to justice and prevented her from harming other innocent people. As Trevor rebuilt his life in the aftermath of Sarah's conviction, he often reflected on the signs he had missed and the questions he should have asked during their marriage. But he also recognized that Sarah's deception had been so sophisticated and her manipulation so skillful that even trained investigators had been fooled by her false identities. The experience had taught him to trust his instincts and to never stop asking questions when something didn't feel right, lessons that would serve him well in his new role helping other victims of fraud and identity theft. If this story has shown you anything, it's that the people closest to us can sometimes be hiding the darkest secrets. Make sure to like this video if you found it as shocking as I did, and subscribe for more incredible true crime stories that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about human nature. Because sometimes, the most dangerous predators are the ones who know exactly how to make us trust them completely.